Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into the really intricate world of federal tax legislation.
Yeah, and the national debt, too. Trillions of dollars.
Exactly, trillions. And these pretty intense political battles happening right now in Washington, D.C., they could genuinely shape our economic future for decades.
It's a lot to get your head around.
It is. But we're going to try and make it clear and compelling for you. Today's deep dive, it's based on a whole stack of detailed analyses, from places like Bessemer Trust, the Brookings Institution.
The Peterson Foundation, CBO.
Right, the Congressional Budget Office. So our mission here is to unpack the current status of these negotiations.
Look at the competing priorities, too. Lots of different ideas floating around.
And the economic stakes involved, which are huge, and crucially, what it all means for you, the individual taxpayer and citizen.
You're absolutely right. The stakes are just enormous. We really are at a kind of turning point for the nation's finances. And truly grasping these dynamics is just crucial for everyone. It's a complex landscape, no doubt. But understanding the core tensions, it reveals so much about where our economy might actually be headed.
So let's start with the colossal figure that looms over all these discussions, the national debt.
The big one.
Right now, it stands at an astounding $36 trillion.
$36 trillion. It's hard to even visualize.
It is. That number alone is staggering. But here's where it gets even more sobering. It's projected to grow to an incredible $58 trillion by 2034.
Wow.
And listen to this. That's without extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA.
So that's the baseline, even before factoring in potential future tax cuts.
Exactly. The major tax reform from 2017 isn't even in that $58 trillion projection if its temporary parts expire.
And what's particularly alarming is just the sheer velocity of this accumulation.
How fast it's piling up.
Yeah. For just the first half of this current fiscal year, so through March 2025, our deficit already topped $1.3 trillion.
$1.3 trillion in just 6 months.
That's right. And that's a significant jump from the year before. It's mostly driven by spending increases in, Medicare, Social Security.
The big entitlement programs.
Right. But also, and this is really disturbing, by the rising cost of interest on the public debt.
The interest payments.
Think about this. Interest payments on our debt are now the second largest federal expenditure.
Second largest. What's first?
Only Social Security is bigger. Interest has actually outpaced defense spending.
Interest costs more than our entire military budget.
That's the situation we're in now.
That shift interest higher than defense, that isn't just some dry number, is it? There's a powerful historical warning there.
There really is.
Have you heard of Ferguson's Law, named after the English historian Sir James Ferguson?
I have. It basically suggests, right, that a civilization starts to decline when its interest expense, its debt payments exceed what it spends on defense.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is how history seems to offer this stark parallel.
It's not just some academic theory, is it? Ferguson's Law reflects a critical tipping point. And we've seen this pattern repeat through time. You look at ancient Egypt, the Roman Empire.
The Spanish Empire in the 17th century.
The British Empire, even the Soviet Union, it's a recurring theme.
So when a nation's ability to invest, to innovate, to protect itself is overshadowed by the cost of its past debts,
it's a profound reorientation of national priorities. Right now, every single dollar we spend on interest is a dollar not invested in, say, future infrastructure or R&D or even basic services.
It really forces us to ask, are we mortgaging our future to pay for our past?
That's the question, isn't it?
That really brings it home. So let's connect this directly. What does this rising debt mean for you listening right now?
Well, the Peterson Foundation, they worked with the UI on this, did some detailed analysis.
Right.
They looked at the projected negative impacts on the U.S. economy, specifically compared to a scenario where our debt-to-GDP ratio stays stable at 100%.
Okay, so what did they find?
Their findings are quite direct, quite stark about the impact on individuals and the wider economy. If these debt trends continue, they project that by 2035, the U.S. economy could shrink by hundreds of billions of dollars.
Hundreds of billions.
And potentially reaching a $1.8 trillion reduction by 2075.
Wow. And in more tangible terms, jobs, wages.
Yeah, that's where it hits home. It could translate to a reduction of maybe 1.2 million jobs by 2035.
1.2 million fewer jobs.
Escalating perhaps to 3.6 million fewer jobs by 2075. And private investment,
Yeah.
The fuel for future growth could see a reduction of over 13% by 2035.
And wages. What about people's paychecks?
That's maybe the most direct impact for households. Wage rates could see a noticeable reduction, potentially over 5% lower by 2075, compared to that stable debt scenario.
So to put it plainly, it really means potentially fewer job opportunities.
Lower wages for the jobs that are there.
And just a smaller overall economy down the line if these debt trends continue unchecked. It genuinely impacts your pocketbook directly.
No question about it.
Okay, so the sheer scale of the debt is one massive issue. But before we can even talk about which tax cuts might get extended or how we pay for them,
Right.
we have to grapple with this fundamental disagreement in Washington about how we even count the cost.
The baseline battle.
Exactly, the baseline battle. There's this critical difference, isn't there, between the current law baseline and the current policy baseline?
Huge difference. Current law assumes expiring things, like parts of the TCJA, actually expire as the law is written.
Okay.
Current policy, on the other hand, sort of assumes those expiring things just get extended permanently, like they're already baked in.
Which dramatically changes how you score the cost of actually extending them, right?
Completely.
Yeah.
And this is where you hear strong criticism from, budget hawks and others.
What kind of criticism?
They call the current policy baseline things like intellectually dishonest, magic math, fairy dust, even budget fraud.
Strong words.
Very strong. Representative David Schweikert, Republican from Arizona, he put it bluntly. It's intellectually a fraud. It's an intellectual fraud to say, let's ignore the actual law and let's just keep doing what we're doing because it's convenient.
Wow.
And Representative Chip Roy, Republican from Texas, was even more colorful. This is fairy dust, and they're full of crap.
Okay, so pretty clear feelings there.
Yeah. And it's worth noting, the Joint Committee on Taxation, the JCT, they're the official scorekeepers. Their default is the current law baseline. That tells you something.
Okay, so using that standard current law baseline, what's the estimated cost of extending the TCJA?
Well, the JCT put out a very preliminary estimate, extending the full TCJA plus some expired business tax breaks.
Like bonus depreciation, R&D expensing.
Exactly. Things businesses really care about. The estimate is about $4.6 trillion in lost revenue.
$4.6 trillion.
Plus another $900 billion in added interest costs. So you're looking at around $5.5 trillion over 10 years.
$5.5 trillion added to the debt.
According to that JCT estimate, yes. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has a similar estimate, maybe closer to $6 trillion added to deficits.
But then you have things like the Senate's amended budget resolution.
Right, which used a current policy baseline.
And using that baseline, they argued it would allow a permanent extension of the TCJA without any budgetary impact.
See the difference. One baseline says $5.5 trillion cost, the other says zero cost.
Even though the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget looked at that same resolution and estimated it would add $5.8 trillion in new deficits.
It really is a fundamental disagreement on the numbers you even start with, which leads right into this idea of dynamic scoring.
The idea that tax cuts pay for themselves through growth.
Sort of. The idea is that tax cuts might stimulate enough economic growth to offset some of the revenue loss. The question is how much?
And what do the experts say?
Well, the Penn-Wharton budget model, for instance, suggests the dynamic effects from extending TCJA are likely pretty small.
How small?
Maybe offsetting only 5%, perhaps 10% of the bill's cost. Not insignificant, but nowhere near paying for itself.
Yet some proposals, like the House budget resolution, assume, a massive amount of growth revenue.
Yeah, they assume $2.6 trillion in extra revenue just from economic growth spurred by the policies.
$2.6 trillion.
Which has been widely called fantasy math because it's just far more than most economists predict.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. This fundamental disagreement on how we even calculate the cost. Some calling it magic math. That's a pretty politically charged label.
It definitely is.
What's the actual impact of this accounting battle on the legislative process? Does it genuinely mislead people, or is it just political theater?
Oh, I think the impact is profound. It's not just theater.
How so?
Because the baseline you choose frames the entire debate. It sets the terms.
Okay.
If you start with a current policy baseline where extensions appear to cost nothing, well, that makes them politically much easier to pass, doesn't it?
Right. You can say, see, no new debt.
Exactly. But if you use the standard current law baseline, those trillions in new debt become undeniable.
Which makes it much harder to justify without finding huge spending cuts or other ways to pay for it.
Precisely. So it's a strategic choice. It fundamentally alters public perception and the political feasibility of the entire legislative package.
Yeah.
It's central to the fight.
And this whole fiscal battle often plays out using a specific legislative tool, right? Reconciliation.
That's right, the Reconciliation Act. It's a powerful mechanism
Why is it so powerful?
because it allows Congress, specifically the Senate, to pass certain budget-related legislation with just a simple majority vote.
So 51 votes instead of the usual 60 needed to overcome a filibuster.
Exactly. It bypasses the filibuster for these specific types of bills. And Republican leaders are definitely looking to use this fast-track process.
Is there a target date?
They're aiming to get legislation done relatively quickly, maybe by late May or August of 2025.
But even with that fast-track tool, it's not smooth sailing, is it? There seem to be significant internal divides within the Republican Party itself.
Oh, absolutely. Big divides. On one side, you have the staunch budget hawks.
Who are they focused on?
Think Representative Thomas Massie from Kentucky, Representative David Schweikert from Arizona, whom we mentioned earlier. Their absolute primary focus is on deep spending cuts and aggressively reducing deficits.
So they're likely opposed to any legislation that adds to the debt, even tax cuts.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
They see the debt as the overriding issue, period.
Okay, so that's one faction.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you see this fascinating tension within the majority party.
Yeah.
They have this powerful tool, reconciliation, to push legislation through.
Yeah.
But their own internal disagreements over priorities, like deep spending cuts versus popular tax breaks, create huge hurdles.
Like the SALT deduction issue.
Exactly. That's another powerful faction. Republicans from high-tax states, often called the SALT caucus,
What are they demanding?
they want to significantly increase or even fully repeal the $10,000 cap on the state and local tax, or SALT, deduction that was put in place by the TCJA.
And repealing that would be expensive.
Very.
Okay.
Full repeal alone could cost something like $1.2 trillion over 10 years. And because the Republican majority in the House is so thin,
They have a lot of leverage.
significant leverage, they can threaten to withhold votes if their demands aren't met.
And I remember reading about divides over clean energy credits, too, from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes, another fault line. Budget hawks generally call for a full repeal of those credits. They argue it could generate maybe $851 billion in revenue gains, helping offset tax cuts.
Yes.
But Republicans from districts that have actually benefited from those investments, maybe new factories, energy projects,
They obviously disagree.
right, they don't want to repeal programs bringing jobs and investment back home.
Right.
So it's this constant balancing act, fiscal conservatism versus local economic interests.
And how does President Trump fit into all this? What's his influence?
It seems to be a key factor, particularly in unifying Republican votes when needed.
How so?
Well, he's been known to exert significant pressure. For example, reports suggest he helped get the House budget resolution passed by setting a clear $1 trillion target for spending cuts.
So he can kind of rally the troops.
It appears so. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise was even quoted saying, "Donald Trump is the whip now." His active involvement will undoubtedly shape the final tax bill.
Now, beyond just extending the existing TCJA cuts, what other tax proposals are actually on the table?
There's quite a list. We already mentioned restoring those expired business tax breaks, 100% bonus depreciation, R&D expensing. That alone could be around $600 billion.
Okay, what else?
Well, there are some broader ideas floating around, like excluding tipped income from taxation.
Really? Tips wouldn't be taxed.
That's one proposal. Others include excluding overtime wages, maybe even Social Security benefits from income tax.
Those sound like major changes.
They would be. Also talk of deducting car loan interest, expanding various family and affordable housing tax credits.
And rolling back some Biden-era policies.
Right, like the stock buyback excise tax. And of course, there's always talk about repealing or significantly reducing the estate tax.
The death tax, as some call it.
Exactly. But that one faces pretty significant hurdles because of its potential budget impact and the Byrd rule in the Senate.
What's the Byrd rule again?
It's basically a Senate procedural safeguard. It's designed to prevent policy changes that are extraneous or unrelated to the budget from sneaking into these reconciliation bills.
So the estate tax changes might not qualify for reconciliation.
They might not. It could very well need 60 votes in the Senate, which makes it extremely challenging to pass in the current environment.
And one more piece here seems relevant. The IRS funding. What happened there?
Right. In a move with clear fiscal implications, another $20.2 billion of IRS enforcement funding was rescinded back in March 2025.
Rescinded meaning taken back.
Correct, clawed back. This brings the total amount taken back to about $41.8 billion out of the $45.6 billion that was initially allocated under the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically for IRS enforcement.
And what does the CBO say about the impact of cutting IRS enforcement funding?
Well, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that this specific action would reduce individual and corporate income tax receipts by $66 billion.
So cutting the funding reduces tax collection by more than the amount cut.
That's their estimate, which results in a net increase in the projected cumulative deficit of about $46 billion over the long run.
So framed as a spending cut, but it actually adds to the deficit because the IRS collects less owed tax money.
That's the CBO's analysis, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It reduces the IRS's ability to collect taxes that are legally owed.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to another perennial hot-button issue, the debt ceiling.
Ah, yes, the debt ceiling, a uniquely American feature.
It originated way back in 1917, right? But what's crucial to understand and often misunderstood is what it actually does.
Right. It doesn't limit how much the government will spend in the future. Congress does that through appropriations bills.
So what does it limit?
It limits the government's ability to borrow money to pay bills it has already incurred, bills based on past spending decisions made by Congress and presidents.
So it's about paying for commitments we've already made, not approving new spending.
Precisely. It's like getting your credit card bill for things you already bought. The debt ceiling is about whether you can pay that bill.
Which makes the negotiations around it often feel like, well, a high-stakes game of chicken.
Or debt roulette, as some have called it. And the perils of that brinkmanship are just immense.
What are the potential consequences of actually defaulting?
They're dire. Moody's Analytics, for instance, estimated that a protracted default could lead to millions of American jobs lost.
Millions?
Yes. It could upend financial markets globally, potentially erasing trillions. They estimated $15 trillion in household wealth. It'd be a self-inflicted economic catastrophe.
And yet, we keep having these standoffs. Why?
Well, one study by DiGiuseppe and Shea found something interesting. They suggested that public ignorance, or maybe just uncertainty, about how bad the consequences would be.
Plays a role.
Yeah, a non-trivial role, as they put it, in allowing public support for these very hardline negotiating positions.
So if people don't fully grasp the potential economic pain, they're less likely to pressure politicians to just make a deal.
That seems to be the implication. And interestingly, that same study found that when you provide credible information about the actual consequences,
what happens?
Support for making concessions, for reaching a deal, actually increases among both Democrats and Republicans.
So an informed public is pretty crucial here.
It highlights the importance, absolutely. And we've seen this dynamic before, haven't we?
Echoes of past fights.
Definitely. That debt ceiling showdown back in 1996 between President Clinton and congressional Republicans, there's an eerie sense of déjà vu to some of the debates we hear today.
And isn't there also some constitutional debate swirling around the debt ceiling itself?
There is, yes.
Yeah.
Particularly concerning the 14th Amendment.
What does that say?
Section 4 states that the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Some legal scholars argue that this means hitting the debt ceiling and defaulting is actually unconstitutional.
An ongoing debate.
Very much so. And in the meantime, when the limit is actually reached, the Treasury has to resort to these so-called extraordinary measures.
What are those? Like accounting maneuvers?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Things like temporarily suspending investments in certain government retirement funds to free up borrowing room.
And buy some time?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're temporary fixes, ways to delay the deadline, but they don't solve the underlying problem or the potential for crisis. So, as you can really see, this whole 2025 tax legislation process is just incredibly complex.
Yeah, a lot of moving parts.
It's marked by these deep divisions, even within the majority party. Fundamental disagreements on how you even account for the costs, that whole magic math controversy.
Right.
And all under the ever-present shadow of this massive national debt and its very real economic consequences.
Uncertainty seems to be the word.
Uncertainty truly reigns, and months of hard negotiations likely still remain. The outcome is going to influence so much.
Whether tax cuts are permanent or maybe just shortened.
Exactly. And what spending cuts, if any, are actually achieved in the end, it's all still very much up in the air.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to think about. In this era of razor-thin majorities and these fundamental disagreements over how we do the math, The future of our nation's finances isn't just some abstract political talking point, is it?
Not at all.
It's a dynamic, high-stakes negotiation that will directly impact your wallet, your job, and the economic landscape for generations to come.
Mm-hmm.
So, given the economic stakes we've discussed and those historical warnings about national debt, it raises an important question for you. How much economic pain is worth the potential political gain in these high-stakes negotiations? And what responsibility do individual citizens like you bear in understanding and perhaps influencing these incredibly complex fiscal choices? What stands out to you from today's discussion?